Christmas morning arrived wrapped in hymns and frost, but for her it came screaming. The bells rang as the auctioneer's voice cut through the air. And before the sun could climb the sky, her baby was torn from her arms and sold like a trinket meant for someone else's joy. The plantation smiled, prayed, celebrated, while a mother stood hollow, listening to her child's cries fade into silence. By noon the masters toasted peace. By dusk they forgot her name. But grief has a way of sharpening into something dangerous. As night fell and the candles burned low, she stopped begging and started remembering every lash, every promise broken, every prayer unanswered. The fields held their breath. The big house slept, confident in its walls and wealth. They never heard her footsteps. They never smelled the oil until it was too late. By Christmas night the plantation would glow brighter than any candle lit, not by mercy but by a mother's fury, and a truth the flames would finally force the world to see. The morning broke with a strange stillness, the kind that settled over the plantation only on special days when work slowed and the masters pretended the world was gentler than it truly was. Frost clung to the edges of the fields, silvering the broken stalks and the packed earth where bare feet had bled in other seasons. Christmas morning they called it, a day of mercy, a day of smile. The bells from the distant church rang thin and cold, their sound floating over the quarters like a promise that had never once been kept. People stirred quietly, pulling thin blankets tighter, whispering prayers that mixed hope with fear, because holidays on plantations often carried surprises, and surprises rarely favored the enslaved. She woke before the sun as she always did, her body trained by years of pain and routine. Her baby slept against her chest, warm and soft, a small miracle breathing in the darkness. For a moment she allowed herself to believe that this morning might pass like the others, that the child would still be there when the bells stopped ringing, that Christmas might mean nothing more than an extra ration or a half smile from someone pretending to be kind. Outside, footsteps crunched on frozen ground, heavier than usual, purposeful. Voices murmured, low and businesslike, not the lazy calls of overseers beginning a workday but something sharper, something organized. When the door to the quarters was thrown open, the cold rushed in first, biting skin and stealing breath. Men stood there in coats too fine for field work, boots polished, faces tight with anticipation. One of them read names from a folded paper, his voice flat as if he were counting tools rather than people. Each name struck the air like a blow. Mothers stiffened, fathers lowered their eyes. She felt her heart begin to pound when she heard her own name spoken, followed by the word child. The baby stirred, sensing the tension, letting out a small confused sound that sliced straight through her chest. They herded them toward the main yard, past the big house that loomed pale and clean against the gray sky. Decorations hung from its porch, greenery and ribbons meant to signal joy. Smoke rose from its chimneys, carrying the smell of roasting meat, rich and heavy, a cruel contrast to the hunger twisting inside her. In the yard, a platform had been erected overnight. She had seen such platforms before, had watched others stand there while their lives were weighed and measured in coins. She had prayed never to be near one again, never to feel that particular kind of air, thick with judgment and ownership. People gathered quickly, masters, guests, traders who smiled too easily. Their laughter sounded wrong against the quiet terror rippling through the enslaved crowd. The auctioneer climbed the platform, adjusting his coat, clearing his throat as if preparing for a performance. He wished everyone a Merry Christmas, his voice bright, almost cheerful. A few of the white onlookers chuckled. She felt her knees weaken, her arms tightening instinctively around her baby, as if sheer force of will could fuse them together, make separation impossible. The auction began with others. Older men, women with tired eyes, children just past the age of usefulness to their mothers, and just young enough to fetch a good price. Each sale landed like a hammer. Names were called, bodies inspected, bids shouted. She barely heard the numbers, barely saw the faces, because all she could feel was the small heartbeat against her own, fast and fragile. When the auctioneer's gaze finally found her, she shook her head before he even spoke, a silent plea that meant nothing to anyone who mattered. Strong woman, he said, gesturing toward her as if she were livestock. Healthy child. Hands reached for her, pulling her forward. She resisted, not violently at first, just clinging harder, whispering frantic words into her baby's ear, words of love, words of apology, words that felt too big and too final. Fingers pried at her arms. Someone laughed nervous. Someone else told her to behave, reminded her it was Christmas, as if that word held any power here. The baby cried then, a sharp, desperate sound that cut through the yard and made a few heads turn. For a fraction of a second she thought she saw hesitation on one face, a flicker of discomfort. It vanished as quickly as it came. The auctioneer raised his voice, talking over the crying, over her sobs, announcing bids. The numbers climbed. Each increase felt like a step farther away from her child. She screamed when hands finally tore the baby from her arms, her body lunging forward, nails scraping uselessly against wool and leather. The world narrowed to that single moment. Empty arms, the echo of her child's cry, the sight of a stranger holding what had been hers, what still was hers in every way that mattered. Her scream tore out of her throat raw and broken, drawing murmurs from the crowd. Someone struck her, hard enough to knock her to her knees, told her to be quiet, told her she was embarrassing herself. She tasted blood, coppery and warm, mixing with tears that froze on her cheeks. The sale was quick after that. A final shout, a sharp crack of the gavel, applause from a few scattered hands. "Merry Christmas," someone said again. The baby was carried away, the sound of crying fading as the buyer turned toward his carriage. She crawled forward, reaching, her vision blurring, her body screaming for what it had lost. Boots blocked her path. A boot nudged her aside like she was nothing more than an inconvenience on a festive morning. They dragged her back, forced her to stand with the others as the auction continued, as if her world had not just ended. She could still hear the bells from the church, cheerful and distant, ringing over the yard like a cruel joke. Smoke from the chimneys drifted down thick and sweet, making her stomach churn. Her arms ached with emptiness, muscles twitching as if the baby might suddenly reappear there, if they just remembered how to hold. By the time the sun climbed higher, it was done. The platform stood empty, the crowd thinned, voices turning back to laughter, plans for dinner, for celebration. She remained where she was, staring at the spot where her child had last been, the ground scuffed and dirty, marked by boots and dragged feet. Christmas morning moved on around her, bright and uncaring, while something inside her shattered and rearranged itself into a shape that felt sharp, heavy and unbearably awake. Her arms remembered the weight, long after it was gone. They stayed curved, aching as if the child were still there, as if muscle and bone refused to accept the truth her eyes had already seen. The space against her chest felt wrong, cold in a way the winter air could not explain. She stood where they had left her, surrounded by movement and noise, yet trapped inside a silence so loud it pressed against her ears. People walked past, orders were shouted, laughter rose and fell. None of it reached. All she could feel was the absence, a hollow carved out in a single violent moment. She had held that baby since the first breath, since the pain and blood and terror of bringing new life into a world designed to crush. She remembered the heat of that day, the way she had bitten down on her own screams, so no one would accuse her of being dramatic, the way her hands had shaken when they placed the tiny body on her chest. From that moment, every breath she took had been measured against the child. Every step she walked through the fields, every lash she endured, every night she collapsed onto hard ground, it had all been survived because the baby was still there. Now her arms trembled uselessly, gripping nothing. She staggered forward once more, instinct dragging her body in the direction the buyer had gone. Her legs barely obeyed, each step felt delayed, as if her mind and body were no longer moving at the same speed. She called out, her voice cracked and hoarse, not forming words at first, just sound, raw and animal. Someone grabbed her shoulder and yanked her back. The sudden contact sent a jolt through her, rage and panic flaring together. She fought then, nails scratching, teeth snapping at air, driven by something deeper than fear. It did not matter. It never did. Hands restrained her, rough and practiced. A blow landed against her ribs, knocking the breath from her lungs. She folded inward, gasping, her cry breaking off into a strangled sound. As she bent forward, she caught a glimpse of the baby one last time, a small bundle wrapped hastily, held awkwardly by unfamiliar arms. The child's face was red and twisted with crying mouth open, eyes squeezed shut. That image burned itself into her mind, sharper than any pain, more permanent than any scar. The distance between them grew with each step the buyer took. 10 steps, 20, a lifetime. The sound of crying faded, swallowed by the creak of the carriage, by the murmur of voices, by the jingling of harness and chain. She strained to hear it, tilting her head like an animal listening for danger, terrified of the moment when the sound would disappear completely. When it finally did, something inside her chest collapsed, not all at once, but slowly, piece by piece. They forced her to stand upright again, as if posture mattered now, as if dignity could be demanded after what had been done. Someone told her to calm herself, to remember her place. Another voice reminded her she was still useful, still owned, still breathing only by permission. The words slid over her without meaning. Her gaze stayed fixed on the empty yard, on the frozen ground where her knees had scraped, on the faint marks left by boots and dragging feet. That was where her baby had been taken from her. Sand, That patch of earth had witnessed it. The ground knew even if no one else cared. Her body began to shake then, deep, uncontrollable tremors that started in her hands and spread through her arms, her shoulders, her legs. She could not stop it. Each shudder felt like a wave breaking against a shore that had already eroded away. Her teeth chattered, not from cold alone, but from shock, from a terror so complete it left no room for anything else. Someone shoved her toward the line of others, back into order, back into the shape of obedience. She stumbled, nearly falling, caught herself on another woman's arm. That woman did not speak. She did not need to. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that look lived a shared understanding too heavy for words. Loss recognized loss. Pain saw itself reflected. The woman's grip tightened, steadying her, anchoring her to the present, even as everything inside her tried to flee. She nodded once, a small motion, not comfort, not reassurance, but acknowledgement of what had just been stolen. Then the grip loosened, because holding on too long could draw attention, and attention could be deadly. As they were marched away from the yard, her mind fractured into memories she could not control. She saw her baby's first night, tiny fists flailing in the dark, her own body curled protectively around the small warm. She heard the soft sounds made during sleep, the way the baby rooted instinctively, trusting without knowing why. She remembered humming under her breath while working, melodies passed down in whispers, songs meant to soothe, to survive. Each memory rose up and cut her anew, sharper than the last, because now they had nowhere to land, no future to attach themselves to. Her milk came in as they walked, a cruel betrayal of her own body. Her breasts ached and throbbed, heavy and full, responding to a child who was no longer there. The pain was constant, insistent, impossible to ignore. She pressed her arms against herself, not to hide the swelling but because the pressure hurt less than the emptiness. Every step sent a jolt through her, a reminder that her body still believed in something that had been ripped away. Someone ahead began to sing, a low, slow hymn, meant to keep time, meant to remind them of order. The sound made her stomach twist. Christmas songs had drifted over the plantation that morning, cheerful and hollow. Now this hymn felt like mockery, like a command to accept what could never be accepted. Her lips moved without sound, shaping words meant only for her child, promises she had made silently in the dark, promises she could no longer keep. By the time they reached the quarters, her strength was gone. She collapsed onto the rough floor, knees hitting hard, hands splayed uselessly in front of her. No one told her to get up. No one needed to. She would rise when ordered. She always did. For now, she stayed there, breathing shallowly, staring at the wall where faint scratches marked the passage of years, and people long gone. Her arms twitched again, reaching without permission, fingers curling around air that did not resist, did not respond, did not cry back. Inside her something shifted, heavy and slow, like a door closing deep within a long corridor. The pain did not lessen. It changed. It settled. It spread out, filling every corner, leaving no space untouched. Her thoughts stopped circling and began to sink, dropping into a depth where grief hardened into something denser, something that did not float away with tears. She lay there listening to the sounds of the plantation resuming its rhythm, the world continuing as if nothing sacred had been violated, as if a child had not just been torn from a mother's arms on Christmas morning, as if the scream still echoing in her chest would ever be answered, as if her hands would ever forget the exact shape and warmth of what they had lost, as if the emptiness would not follow her into every breath, every step, every dark hour that waited ahead. The celebration began almost immediately, as if the sale had been nothing more than a brief interruption in a festive schedule. Laughter drifted across the yard, light and careless, bouncing off the walls of the big house. Someone uncorked a bottle, the sharp pop followed by approving murmurs. The smell of food grew stronger, as servants hurried to prepare tables heavy with meat, bread and sweets meant to honor the dead. Christmas, they kept saying, as though the word itself could bless whatever had just happened, as though it could wash blood and tears from the frozen ground. She stood apart from it all, her body present, but her mind stranded somewhere behind her ribs, where the echo of her child's cry still rang. No one looked at her directly anymore. She had become an inconvenience that had already been dealt with, a problem solved, a line crossed off a list. The masters moved easily among their guests, hands clasping shoulders, smiles wide and practiced. Their voices carried warmth, stories of good fortune, of prosperity, of the coming year. They spoke of family, while hers was being driven farther away with every turn of a carriage wheel. From where she stood, she could see the windows of the big house, glowing softly despite the daylight, candles already lit for the evening feast. Curtains fluttered slightly as people passed behind them, shadows crossing in slow, contented motion. Music began somewhere inside, a piano striking bright notes that spilled out into the cold air. The sound made her stomach clench. Each note felt like a reminder that joy was being performed, deliberately, loudly, so that silence and grief would have no place to exist. Someone nearby laughed too hard. The sound, sharp and sudden, it startled her, made her flinch as if struck. She realized then how fragile she felt, how thin the barrier was between standing and collapsing entirely. Her knees threatened to give way again, her vision darkening at the edge. She steadied herself against a post, the rough wood biting into her palm. The physical pain helped, grounding her just enough to stay upright, to remain unseen in her weakness. The enslaved were ordered back to their tasks, back to motion, back to usefulness. Christmas did not excuse them from labor, it only changed its shape. Some were sent to help serve the feast, to pour wine, to smile when spoken to stand quietly while plates were filled and emptied. Others were directed to clean, to carry, to prepare spaces meant for pleasure. The work moved around her like a current, pulling everyone along. She followed because her body knew how, because stopping completely was not allowed. As she walked past the big house, she caught fragments of conversation drifting through open doors, plans for dinner, jokes about the auction, spoken lightly, stripped of any weight. A man remarked that business had been good that morning, that prices were better than expected. Another agreed, mentioning the child as if it were an object, an investment that would grow and pay off. Their words floated out and wrapped around her, each one landing with dull force, not sharp enough anymore to shock, just heavy enough to sink deep. Inside one of the rooms, a group gathered around a table, hands clasped as someone began to pray. She slowed, listening despite herself. The prayer was long and polished, thanking God for blessings received, for family gathered, for prosperity earned through hard work. They asked for peace, for goodwill, for joy to fill their hearts on this holy day. Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to rush in and tear the words from the air, to ask what kind of God listened to prayers spoken over stolen children. Instead, she stood frozen, nails digging into her palms, feeling something inside her twist, tighter with every carefully chosen word. When the prayer ended, there was a chorus of amens, followed immediately by the scrape of chairs and the clink of silverware. Life resumed its pleasant rhythm. Plates were filled, glasses were raised. Someone proposed a toast to Christmas, to tradition, to the order of the word order hung there, heavy with meaning, and she felt it settle onto her shoulders like a familiar weight, one she had carried all her life. She was sent to the edge of the room, instructed to stand and wait. From there she watched them, watched grease shine on their fingers, watched crumbs scatter across fine cloth, watched mouths open and close in easy conversation. The sight of food made her stomach twist, hunger and nausea tangling together. She had not eaten since before dawn, had not even thought of it until now. Her body still demanded care, still functioned according to its needs, despite the fact that everything she cared for had been torn away. At one point a child ran through the room, laughing, chased by an indulgent adult. The sound pierced her like a blow. She turned her head sharply, unable to stop herself, her eyes following the movement with desperate intensity. For a heartbeat, she imagined it was her child, free and safe running toward her with outstretched arms. The illusion shattered instantly, leaving behind a pain so sharp it stole her breath. She lowered her gaze, focusing on the floor, on the pattern of the rug, on anything that would not remind her of what she had lost. The hours passed slowly, marked by the lowering of the sun, and the deepening of shadows. Candles were lit in earnest now, their flames steady and warm, casting a golden glow that softened faces and blurred edges. Laughter grew louder, as wine flowed more freely. Stories were told and retold, each one reinforcing a shared sense of belonging. They spoke of ancestors, of land passed down, of traditions on. She listened, silent and invisible, thinking of the tradition that had just been enacted outside, the one that did not require storytelling, because it repeated itself endlessly. No one spoke to her unless it was to issue a command. When they did, their voices were casual, untroubled, as if she were nothing more than a piece of furniture that occasionally needed repositioning. She obeyed automatically, her movements precise and efficient, honed by years of survival. Inside, though, something had gone still. The frantic edge of her grief had dulled, replaced by a heavy sinking calm that felt unnatural, dangerous. It was the quiet that came after screaming, until there was no voice left. As night settled fully, the celebration showed no sign of slow. Music played again, louder this time,
accompanied by clapping and singing. The words of the carols floated through the house, familiar and distorted, stripped of any comfort they might once have held. Peace on earth, goodwill to men. She wondered who those words were meant for, who was included in their promise, who had been excluded so completely, that their suffering could coexist so easily with such songs. She was dismissed eventually, told to return to the quarter. The order came without ceremony, without acknowledgement of her presence beyond its usefulness. She left the warmth of the big house, and stepped back into the cold night air. The contrast was sharp, the chill biting through thin fabric. Behind her the windows glowed brightly, a cluster of light against the darkness, filled with movement and sound. Ahead of her lay the path back, uneven and dim, leading to a place where silence waited. As she walked, the sounds of celebration faded, replaced by the familiar noises of the plantation at night. Crickets chirred faintly, wood creaked. Somewhere, someone coughed in their sleep. The world had not ended, it had barely paused. That realization pressed down on her chest, heavier than any blow she had taken that morning. The masters would sleep well that night, bellies full, hearts light, convinced of their righteousness, while she lay awake with arms that still ached to hold a child who was already far beyond her. She reached the quarters and stepped inside, the door closing softly behind her. The space was dim, lit only by a few dying embers. Bodies lay curled on the floor, exhausted, resigned, breathing in shallow, uneven rhythm. She moved to her place and sank down, her back against the wall, her head dropping forward. The noise of the celebration was gone now, but its presence lingered, echoing in her mind, each laugh and song, replaying itself with cruel clarity. She pressed her fists against her thigh, feeling the tension coiled there, contained for the moment, waiting, while outside the big house continued to glow, bright and confident in the darkness, celebrating a Christmas built on silence, obedience and a stolen child, unaware of the weight settling in her chest, unaware of how left alone and ignored, could change shape, could harden, could begin to look for somewhere else to go.
The prayers began at dusk when the sky dimmed to a bruised blue and the cold sharpened. They gathered in the parlor, hands folded, heads bowed, voices lowered into a solemn tone meant to signal reverence. Candles flickered along the mantel, their light softening faces, smoothing away lines of cruelty and appetite, turning them into something that almost resembled goodness. From where she stood near the wall, silent and still, she watched the ritual unfold. Every movement precise, rehearsed, empty of risk. The words flowed easily from their mouths. Gratitude first, always gratitude. Thanks for health, for harvests, for prosperity that had somehow arrived without ever acknowledging the backs bent beneath it. They thanked God for order, for stability, for a world that made sense to them because it had been arranged to their advantage. Each phrase landed with careful weight, each pause designed to invite agreement from the room. Murmured affirmations followed, soft and approving, as if heaven itself were nodding along. She kept her eyes lowered, not out of respect but because looking at them made something inside her churn. The sound of prayer wrapped around her like a suffocating cloth, thick and heavy. She had prayed too once, in the fields, in the dark, over a newborn's tiny body. She had whispered words learned from others who whispered, words passed down carefully, altered slightly to avoid punishment, faith reshaped to survive. Those prayers had been desperate, messy, soaked in fear and hope. These were clean, these were confident, these assumed an audience that listened. Someone spoke of mercy, their voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. Mercy for sinners, mercy for the lost, mercy for those less fortunate. The irony burned so sharply it made her jaw tight. She thought of the yard that morning, of the platform, of the way mercy had not even been considered as her child was lifted away. She wondered where mercy had been hiding then, whether it had been waiting politely for the prayer hour, whether it required candles and polished floors to make an appearance. They prayed for peace next, for calm hearts and steady hands. The words peace on earth drifted through the room, familiar from the songs sung earlier, from the decorations strung across the house. She felt a bitter, almost hysterical urge to laugh. Peace had been shattered before sunrise, broken deliberately, loudly. Yet here it was, invoked as if nothing had happened, as if peace were a thing that could be declared into existence by those who never lacked it. As the prayer continued, her attention drifted to small details, the only way she could endure it. The way a man shifted his weight impatiently, the faint clink of jewelry as a woman adjusted her hands, the wax dripping slowly down the side of a candle pooling at its base. Time stretched, each second thick and slow. She wondered if any of them felt the weight of the day pressing against the words they spoke, if any of them sensed the dissonance vibrating in the air. When the prayer ended, There was a collective release, a lifting of heads, a soft exhale. Smiles returned immediately, seamless and practiced. The moment of holiness was over, boxed neatly and set aside. Conversation resumed, as if a switch had been flipped. Plates were cleared, wine was poured. Someone remarked on how moving the prayer had been, how important it was to remember one's blessings. Heads nod approval rippled through the room. She was sent to carry away empty dishes, her presence reduced to function again. As she moved among them, she heard fragments of conversation, casual and cruel in their normalcy. A man spoke about the sale that morning, framing it as necessity, as business, as something unfortunate but unavoidable. Another agreed, adding that discipline and order had to be maintained, even on holidays. Someone joked that Christmas always brought out the sentimental fools, as if compassion were a flaw to be mocked. The talk shifted easily to plans for the coming year, to improvements that would be made, profits expected, land would be expanded, new hands acquired. Children mentioned not as people, but as future labor, as numbers waiting to mature. She listened, silent, invisible, each word sinking into her like sediment, layering itself over the grief already settled there. The prayers had not softened them, they had fortified them, reassured them that whatever they did was sanctioned, righteous, protected. Later, they sang again, hymns this time, voices blending in practiced harmony. The sound was rich, filling the room, rising toward the ceiling. She recognized the melodies, had heard them drifting over the fields on Sundays, had hummed them under her breath while working. Once, they had brought a kind of comfort, a sense of connection to something larger, something that might see and remember. Tonight, the hymns felt hollow, stripped of meaning by the mouths that shaped them. Amazing Grace they sang, voices, swelling on the word grace. She swallowed hard, her throat tightening. Grace had not saved her child. Grace had not stayed the hands that pulled the baby away. Grace had not intervened when she screamed. The song continued, each verse pressing harder, until the words blurred together into sound without sense. She focused on breathing, slow and shallow, keeping herself anchored. One woman closed her eyes as she sang, her face serene, transported. The sight filled her with a sudden, sharp anger. How easily they surrendered to feeling, how safely they could do so. Faith for them was a refuge, a place to rest. For her it had always been a question mark, a fragile thread stretched thin by suffering. Watching them sing, she understood something with painful clarity. Their faith required her pain, it fed on it, it justified it. When the song ended, there was applause, light and appreciative. Someone commented on how blessed they were to live in such a godly household. Another replied that it was important to set an example, to uphold moral order. She stood there, hands folded, eyes lowered, absorbing every word. Moral order. The phrase echoed in her mind, cold and precise. She thought of how order had been enforced that morning, how moral it had looked to those holding power. Outside the night deepened. The windows reflected the candlelight, creating the illusion of warmth and abundance. Beyond that glow lay darkness, fields, quarters filled with quiet suffering. The prayers inside the house had not reached that far. They had not been meant to. They were spoken for the benefit of those who already felt chosen, already felt heard. Eventually the gathering broke apart, people drifting to different rooms, laughter rising again as the solemn mood dissolved. The sacred and the casual blurred together, interchangeable, both serving the same purpose. She was dismissed once more, told she was finished for the evening. The words were spoken kindly enough, as if kindness could erase everything else. She stepped back into the cold, the door closing behind her with a soft finality. The sounds of prayer and song lingered in her ears, echoing against the memory of screams and silence. She walked slowly, each step deliberate, feeling the weight of the day settle deeper into her bones. The prayers had done nothing to ease her pain. They had only highlighted the distance between the words spoken in warmth and the reality lived in shadow. As she reached the quarters, she paused, looking back once at the big house, its windows still glowing, its occupants convinced of their goodness. The image burned itself into her mind alongside the image of the platform, the carriage, the empty space in her arm. False prayers, she thought, though she did not shape the words aloud. Hollow joy, a faith that could kneel beside a crime and rise without ever seeing it. She turned away then, carrying with her the sound of hymns, stripped bare, the certainty that whatever God they prayed to had not been listening to her, and the growing understanding that justice, if it was ever to come, would not arrive on whispered words spoken over candlelight. The night pressed in around her, thick and quiet, broken only by the familiar sounds of bodies settling into uneasy rest. She lay on her side at first, knees drawn up,
arms folded tightly across her chest, as if still guarding something fragile. Sleep did not come. Every time her eyes closed, the image returned with brutal clarity. The baby's face twisted in fear, the sudden emptiness, the way the world had kept moving without pause. After a while she stopped trying to rest and simply stared into the darkness, breathing slow and shallow, letting the hours pass. At some point the pain shifted. It did not lessen. It rearranged itself. The sharp edges dulled, sinking deeper, spreading wider, until it filled her entirely. Tears came at first, hot and unstoppable, soaking into the rough fabric beneath her head. She made no sound. Crying out loud would bring questions, punishment, attention she did not want. She learned to cry the way she had learned everything else, silently, efficiently, without witness. When the tears finally stopped, her eyes burned and her head throbbed, but inside, something else had begun to form. She rolled onto her back and stared up at the low ceiling, tracing familiar cracks with her eyes. Those cracks had been there longer than she could remember. They never changed, no matter what happened below them. The thought settled into her slowly, heavy and undeniable. Nothing in this place changed, unless it was forced to. Prayers had not changed it. Obedience had not changed it. Endurance had not changed it. She had endured all her life, bending, surviving, telling herself that staying alive was victory enough. That belief felt thin now, worn through by the weight of what had been taken. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, nails biting into her palm. The sensation grounded her, pulled her fully back into her body. She became aware of every ache, every bruise, every place where her skin still remembered rough hands and sudden blows. Her body was a map of lessons learned the hard way. She knew how pain worked. She knew how fear worked. And she knew, with a clarity that startled her, how the people who owned this place depended on her fear remaining quiet. She thought of the day in pieces, not as a whole. The sound of bells, the platform, the way laughter had followed her screams, the prayers spoken so smoothly afterward. Each memory rose, hovered, then settled into place like stones laid carefully, deliberately. They stacked inside her, one on top of another, building something solid and heavy. This was no longer just grief. Grief alone begged. Grief knelt. Grief waited for mercy. What was forming now did none of those things. Her breathing slowed, deepened. The frantic flutter in her chest eased, replaced by a steady, almost unnatural calm. She noticed it, and did not resist. Calm felt dangerous, but it also felt strong. In that stillness, her thoughts sharpened. She began to remember details she usually ignored. The way the guards changed shifts, the spots where shadows pooled thickest at night, the places where tools were kept, where supplies were stored. These were things she had seen every day without really seeing, filed away somewhere in her mind for no particular reason. Now they surfaced unbidden, arranging themselves into patterns. She sat up slowly, listening for movement around her. Others slept or pretended to, bodies rising and falling in exhausted rhythm. Someone murmured in a dream. Someone else coughed and turned over. Life went on here, reduced to its most basic function. She felt suddenly separate from it, as if a thin wall had risen between her and the rest of the world. On one side, there was routine, survival, waiting. On the other there was a single burning point of focus. Her child was gone. That truth was absolute, unchangeable. No amount of resolve could undo it. She understood that with painful clarity. What could change was what came next. The people who had smiled that morning believed the story was over. Sale completed, order restored, Christmas celebrated. They believed she would grieve quietly, return to usefulness, fade back into the background where suffering belonged. That belief rested on the assumption that she would remain what they had always needed her to be. She pressed her hand flat against her chest, feeling her heart beat steady and strong. It struck her then that they had miscalculated something fundamental. They had taken the one thing she had been protecting herself for. Every compromise she had made, every humiliation she had swallowed, every fear she had mastered had been endured for her child. Without that anchor, the calculations changed. Fear lost its leverage. Threats rang hollow. Survival alone was no longer the prize. Her thoughts drifted, unbidden, to fire, not as an image of destruction at first, but as warmth, as light pushing back darkness. She remembered how people gathered around it at night, how it demanded attention, how it transformed whatever it touched. Fire did not ask permission. Fire did not negotiate. It consumed. The idea did not frighten her. It settled into her mind with unsettling ease, as if it had been waiting there all along. She stood, careful and silent, and moved toward the door, resting her hand against the. It was solid, familiar, something she had passed through thousands of times without thinking. Tonight, she felt its grain beneath her fingers, every ridge and imperfection. Beyond it lay the plantation, spread out in darkness, confident and asleep. She imagined it from above, the big house at its center, like a beating heart, everything else arranged around it in service. Her jaw tightened. She thought of the hymns, the prayers, the words mercy and peace spoken without hesitation. She thought of the way they would wake in the morning, expecting the world to look exactly the same. The calm inside her deepened further, hardening. This calm did not waver, or plead. It simply observed, measured, waited. She stepped back from the door, and returned to her place, lowering herself to the floor once more. There was no rush. She understood that instinctively. Resolve was not a scream. It was a tightening, a drawing inward, a patient gathering of strength. Around her, the night held its breath, unaware of the shift that had just occurred, unaware that something had crossed a line inside her that could not be uncrossed. Her eyes remained open. As the hours crept toward morning, she listened, watched shadows move, counted heartbeat. Each second added weight to the thing growing inside her, feeding it, shaping it. Grief had burned through her, leaving behind something denser and more dangerous in its wake. By the time the first hint of dawn began to pale the edges of the dark, the decision no longer felt like a choice, but like the only remaining shape her life could take, like a path revealed not by hope or faith, but by the simple, undeniable truth that nothing would ever be the same again, and that whatever came next, would come from her hands, guided by a resolve sharpened by law, carried forward by a calm that did not tremble, did not look back, and did not ask whether the world was ready for what it had made of her. The memories came without warning, slipping through the cracks in her calm like smoke through boards. She did not summon, they rose on their own, each one pulling the next behind it, until her mind was crowded with scenes she had learned to bury deep. The night seemed to invite them, to peel back the layers she had built over years of survival. In the darkness there was nothing to distract her, nothing to soften the edges of what had been done to her long before this day. She remembered her first beating, not the pain itself so much as the confusion that followed. She had been young enough to believe mistakes could be corrected, that punishment would end once the lesson was learned. The overseer's face had been red with irritation, not rage, as if she were an object malfunctioning. The blows had come fast, efficient, delivered with the ease of habit. What stayed with her was not the ache that lingered for days, but the realization that suffering here was not a response to wrongdoing. It was a language, spoken fluently by those in power. Other memories layered themselves on top of that. Long days bent over fields, until her back screamed and her hands bled, the sun pressing down like a weight meant to crush thought itself. Nights spent nursing exhaustion instead of wounds because wounds were expected, unremarkable. Promises made casually and broken just as easily. Words like tomorrow and later dangled in front of her like bait. Each promise had taught her the same lesson. Hope was allowed only in small private amounts, never enough to threaten obedience. She remembered the men who had come to her without asking, without needing to, the way she learned to leave her body when it happened, to fix her gaze on something distant and unimportant, a crack in the wall, a knot in the wood, the way she learned to count breaths, to wait for it to be over. No one had ever apologized, no one had ever acknowledged the violence as violence. It was simply another entitlement exercised, another reminder of where she stood in the order they prayed so hard to preserve. Her child had been born out of that world, shaped by it even before taking a breath. She had sworn, silently and fiercely, that the child would be spared as much of it as possible. That vow had guided every decision she made. She had endured insults she could have answered, swallowed anger that burned her throat, lowered her eyes when every part of her wanted to stare. Protection required invisibility, love required sacrifice. Those beliefs had kept her alive. They had not kept her child. The memory of the broken promises hurt differently now. She recalled a mistress once telling her she was lucky, that her baby would stay on the plantation, that families were valued there. The words had been spoken lightly, almost kindly. She had clung to them, repeated them to herself on hard days. That promise had evaporated without apology, without explanation, replaced by the cold efficiency of a sale. The ease with which it had been discarded echoed through her now, feeding the fire of something darker than grief. She remembered the prayers she had whispered over her child at night, not the polished words spoken in the big house, but desperate, stumbling pleas, shaped by fear and love. She had asked for safety, for time, for the chance to see the child grow past infants. She had asked for mercy she did not fully believe existed, but hoped might hear her anyway. Those prayers had been answered with silence. The silence felt intentional now, heavy with meaning. Her mind moved through years as if flipping through pages, stopping only where the ink was dark. The times she had been punished for things she had not done. The times she had been praised for endurance, as if suffering well were a virtue. The way laughter had followed cruelty. How easily joy and violence had shared the same space. Each memory connected itself to the next, forming a pattern she could no longer ignore. This place did not break people by accident. It was designed to. She opened her eyes wider in the dark, breathing steady, letting the memories do their work. They no longer overwhelmed her. They instructed. Every humiliation she had survived sharpened her understanding of the people who held power here. She knew their habits, their weaknesses, the blind spots created by entitlement. They believed themselves untouchable because they had never been touched in return. That belief pulsed through the plantation like an unspoken law. She thought of the plantation itself as a body, built from wood and stone and confidence. She knew its rhythms intimately. She knew which doors creaked and which did not, which paths were watched and which were ignored. She had walked them carrying water, carrying food, carrying herself quietly from one demand to the next. Those memories rose too, no longer neutral, no longer passive. They rearranged themselves into something purposeful. The past did not ask her what she wanted to do with it. It simply handed itself over, raw and unfiltered. Every scar became a marker. Every broken promise became a warning. Every prayer unanswered became a lesson. She felt the weight of it all settle into her bones, grounding her, steadying her. This was not a sudden transformation. It was an unveiling. What she was becoming had been forming for years, shaped by each act of cruelty endured and survived. She pressed her forehead against her knees, and closed her eyes, letting the memories finish their work. There was no comfort in them, no nostalgia. There was clarity. The world she lived in ran on suffering carefully hidden beneath ritual and tradition. Christmas had not exposed something new. It had simply stripped away the last illusion she had been allowed to keep. The plantation did not just permit cruelty, it required it. It consumed it. It thrived on it. Her child had been taken because the system demanded it, because profit outweighed humanity, because no vow made by someone like her could ever compete with money and power. That truth settled into her with a finality that left no room for bargaining. She did not imagine justice arriving from outside, delivered by prayer or chance. Nothing in her memories suggested that would ever happen. As the night deepened, the memories slowed. Having delivered what they came to give, they left behind a solid understanding of the world as it was, and as it would remain if left undisturbed. She straightened slightly, her body still, her mind alert. Everything she had suffered had led her here, to this precise awareness. The plantation had shaped her with pain and obedience, never imagining those same tools could shape something else entirely. She inhaled deeply, the air cold in her lungs, and held it for a moment before letting it out. The memories did not fade. They took their place, no longer wounds to be avoided, but fuel carefully gathered. Each one added weight to the resolve already forming, feeding it, tempering it. By the time the last echoes of the past settled into silence, there was nothing left inside her that believed in wait, nothing left that trusted promises, nothing left that expected mercy from those who had never shown it. Only the accumulated truth of everything she had endured, standing upright within her, steady and unflinching, ready to move forward, carrying the undeniable history of what had been done and what could no longer be endured.
Night settled fully over the plantation, wrapping it in a confidence born of habit. Darkness here was not feared by those in power. It belonged to them. Another layer of protection they trusted without thought. The big house loomed at the center, its outline familiar against the sky. Windows dim now as lamps were lowered and voices softened. Around it the outbuildings crouched like obedient shadows, barns and sheds arranged neatly. Everything in its assigned place. The order of it all pressed against her senses as she moved quietly. An order she had learned so well it no longer registered as remarkable. She walked without hurry, her steps measured, careful not to draw attention. This was not new to her. She had learned how to move unseen long ago, how to make herself small when necessary, how to pass through spaces without leaving an impression. The guards assumed what they had always assumed, that night belonged to routine, that the enslaved would be exactly where they were expected to be, exhausted and obedient. That assumption was one of the many things she had memorized. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, familiar scents layered with the faint sweetness of leftover food drifting from the big house. Somewhere, a door closed softly. Somewhere else, a laugh faded into sleep. The plantation exhaled, settling into rest. She listened as she walked, not just with her ears but with her whole body. attuned to shifts and absences, to the small sounds that signaled danger. Crickets chirred steadily. An owl called once from the trees. Nothing was out of place. She paused near the edge of the yard, letting her eyes adjust. From here she could see the paths branching out, the ones worn smooth by years of feet carrying burdens. She knew which path led to storage, which to the kitchens, which curved back toward the quarter. She knew which lanterns were left burning and which were extinguished first. All of it lay open before her, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a map she had traced countless times without ever meaning to. Her thoughts remained calm, precise. There was no rush of anger now, no wild surge of emotion that had burned through her earlier, leaving behind something steadier. She evaluated distances without naming them, noticed shadows without counting them. She registered the absence of footsteps where there might have been some on other nights, the subtle change in guard patterns brought on by the holiday's false sense of peace. They were relaxed. They were satisfied. Satisfaction made people careless. As she moved, memories of past nights rose briefly and passed. Nights when she had been ordered to fetch water late, to clean long after others slept, to tend to needs that were never hers. She had walked these grounds under threat and command, her fear sharp enough to keep her alert. Tonight, fear was quieter, pushed to the edges by something else entirely. She felt lighter in a way that startled her, as if a weight she had carried for years had been removed, replaced by purpose. She stopped again, near a low structure set slightly apart from the rest, its door closed, its presence unremarkable. She had passed it hundreds of times. She knew what was kept there, what purpose it served, how often it was checked, and how often it was forgotten. The knowledge settled in her mind without excitement. This was not discovery, it was recollected, finally put to use. She rested her hand against the wall, feeling the texture beneath her fingers. Wood, old and dry in places, newer where repairs had been made hastily. She remembered carrying planks here once, years ago, under supervision that had not bothered to hide its boredom. The memory flickered and faded. What mattered now was not how she had come to know these things, but that a sound drifted from the big house, faint but distinct. The low murmur of voices from an open window. Someone shifted in their sleep. A chair creaked. The building itself seemed to breathe, secure in its size and history. She looked toward it, studying the darkened windows, the lines of the roof, the way it dominated the space around it. It had always been there, watching over everything, a symbol of permanence meant to intimidate simply by existing. She turned away and continued on, keeping to the edges where shadows thickened. Her movements were smooth, unhesitating, guided by an instinct sharpened by years of observation. She was not thinking in terms of destruction or chaos. She was thinking in terms of balance, of consequences finally aligning with actions. The plantation had taken something irreplaceable and gone on celebrating. That imbalance pressed against her mind, demanding correction. As she passed another building, she noticed a lantern left burning inside, its light leaking through a crack. The carelessness struck her with a brief, almost detached awareness. Even their precautions were half-hearted tonight. Christmas had convinced them of their own goodness, their own safety. She did not smile. She did not react at all. She absorbed the detail and moved on. Time felt different now, stretched and compressed at once. Minutes slipped by unnoticed, while individual moments expanded, rich with sensation. The crunch of gravel beneath her foot sent a brief spike of alertness through her, quickly eased when nothing followed. The cold brushed her skin, sharpening her focus. She welcomed it. It reminded her she was fully present, fully awake. She reached the far side of the yard and paused once more, turning slowly, taking in the full spread of the plantation as it slept. From here the order was even clearer, the hierarchy visible in the way buildings clustered and receded. The quarters lay in shadow at the edge, barely lit, barely acknowledged. The big house commanded the center, solid and proud. Everything pointed inward, toward it, toward the source of authority and wealth. She thought briefly of her child again, not with the sharp pain that had nearly undone her earlier, but with a quiet, focused intensity. This was not forgetting, it was carrying forward. The absence in her arms had been replaced by a presence in her chest, something steady and insistent. She placed a hand there for a moment, feeling her heart beat, each pulse a reminder that she was still alive, still capable of action. A distant sound marked the passing of time, the faint strike of a bell somewhere far off, signaling an hour she did not bother to count. The plantation remained asleep. No alarm was raised, no footsteps approached. The world continued to assume its own safety. She shifted her weight and stepped forward again, deeper into the network of familiar paths, her mind clear, her movements deliberate. This was not an impulsive act driven by blind fury. It was the culmination of years of watching, enduring, learning. Everything she needed to know was already within her, placed there by the very system that believed it had mastered her. As she moved, the night seemed to close in behind her, erasing her passage, leaving no trace of intent. The stars above were pale, distant, indifferent. The ground beneath her feet was solid, known, bearing the imprint of countless lives bent to its service. She walked on, guided by memory and resolve, toward the heart of a place that had never imagined itself vulnerable, carrying with her the quiet certainty that the sleep wrapping the plantation was not as deep or as safe as it believed, that the confidence built on suffering always contained within it the conditions of its own undoing, waiting only for someone who knew the ground well enough to move through the darkness without fear. The smell reached her before the light did, sharp and unmistakable, cutting through the cold air, and settling in her lungs. Oil, not imagined, not symbolic, but real, heavy with promise and danger. She moved carefully, aware of every sound her body made, every breath that fogged faintly in the dark. Her hands felt steady, more steady than they ever had before, as if they belonged to someone else entirely, someone shaped for this moment and nothing beyond it. She did not think of fire as chaos. She thought of it as release. She had watched flames before, small ones, contained ones, hearth fires meant to warm and comfort, cooking fires that turned raw things into sustenance. She had seen how quickly those same flames could be feared, if they slipped their boundaries, how people jumped and shouted when control wavered. Fire demanded attention. Fire refused to be ignored. That alone gave it power in a place built on silence. She moved through the shadows with care, her body remembering how to balance weight, how to avoid loose stones and brittle twigs. The night offered cover willingly, as if complicit. Somewhere nearby, wood creaked softly as it cooled, the sound slow and tired. The plantation slept on, unaware that its stillness was being measured against something far more awake. Her mind stayed focused, narrow and clear. She did not catalog steps or plan rates, the way someone unfamiliar might. She relied instead on a deep-lived knowledge, the kind that settled into bones and muscle over years. She knew where things were kept, where attention was paid and where it lacked. She knew which places were trusted too much, assumed to be safe by habit alone. The oil glistened faintly where it touched wood, darkening the surface, soaking in. She watched it spread with a detached interest, noting how quickly it disappeared into grain and crack. Wood remembered oil. It held onto it. That understanding felt important, though she did not linger on why. She moved on, letting the darkness close behind her, leaving no sign beyond the subtle change in smell. Her thoughts flickered briefly to the people sleeping nearby, their breaths even, their dreams undisturbed. She did not imagine their faces. She did not weigh outcomes. The scale had already tipped beyond balance. This was not about spectacle or warning. It was about truth made visible, about the kind of reckoning that could not be prayed away or ignored. As she worked, she felt no rush, no trembling urgency. Time seemed to expand around her, granting space for each movement, each choice. The cold numbed her fingers slightly, but she welcomed the sensation. It kept her grounded, reminded her that she was still flesh and blood, not a force of nature, not a story told later, just a woman moving through the night, carrying the weight of a loss that refused to stay quiet. She paused once, listening. Somewhere, far off, a dog barked, then fell silent. The sound did not travel toward her. No voices followed. The world remained as it was, balanced on the edge of noticing and not noticing. She adjusted her stance and continued, her breathing slow and controlled, her awareness wide. The oil scent grew stronger in certain places, layering itself over the familiar smells of wood and earth. It clung to her clothes, her skin, marking her invisibly. She wondered briefly if the smell would ever leave her, if it would linger long after this night ended. The thought passed without weight. Some things once taken on, were meant to remain. She reached the edge of a structure and stopped, pressing herself close to the wall, feeling the cold seep through fabric. Above her the shape of the building rose into darkness, solid and confident. She thought of all it represented, all it had sheltered and justified. The idea that it could be changed, undone, reduced to something unrecognizable did not feel radical. It felt necessary. Her hand closed around a small source of light, something ordinary and easily overlooked, something she had handled countless times for harmless reasons. Tonight, it felt different in her grip, heavier with meaning. She did not strike it immediately. She waited, listening again, letting the night settle, letting the moment fully arrive. In that pause,
Her child's face surfaced once more, not crying now but still, as it had looked in sleep, features soft and unguarded. The memory did not undo her, it steadied her. She drew a slow breath, feeling the air fill her chest, then leave it again, controlled and deliberate. When the light finally flared, it was brief and contained, a small fierce glow against the dark. She shielded it instinctively, aware of how easily it could betray her presence. The flame wavered, then steadied, its warmth immediate and alive. She watched it for a heartbeat, the way it leaned and stretched, eager and hungry, before lowering it to where oil waited patiently. The reaction was swift, almost graceful. The flame caught and spread, not exploding outward, but sliding along the path laid for it, whispering as it went. Light bloomed low and fast, transforming shadows into sharp shapes that danced and shifted. Heat followed, gentle at first, then insistent, pushing back the cold, licking at the air. She stepped away as the fire found its footing, retreating into darkness while the glow grew behind her. The crackle began softly, a sound like breathing, then deepened, wood answering flame with eager noise. She did not watch for long. Watching was not the point. The fire knew what to do. It did not need her attention to continue. As she moved, the light reflected off surfaces, turning the familiar strange, revealing angles and textures usually hidden. The plantation no longer looked settled or safe. It looked vulnerable, its confidence pierced by flickering gold and orange. Smoke began to curl upward, carrying scent and signal into the night. She did not hurry, but she did not linger either. Her path away was as sure as her path in, guided by the same intimate knowledge. Behind her the fire grew bolder, its voice rising, calling out to anything that would listen. Ahead of her darkness waited, thick and forgiving. Her heart beat steadily as she walked, each pulse in time with the growing roar behind her. She felt the heat brush her back briefly, a final touch, before distance softened. The plantation's silence was broken now, not by screams or commands, but by the undeniable sound of something changing state, something irreversible unfolding. She reached the edge of the yard and paused once more, turning her head slightly as the glow intensified, reflecting off low clouds, staining the sky. The night was no longer entirely dark. Light spilled where it had never been welcome, illuminating the shape of power as it began to fade. She took that in without satisfaction or regret, simply acknowledging it as fact. Then she turned away and continued on, letting the fire speak for her, letting it carry the truth she had been forced to swallow for too long, letting it rise and spread through the heart of a place that had built itself on the belief that it would always stand, confident and untouched, never imagining that the quiet woman who knew its every corner would be the one to show it how quickly certainty could burn. The flames grew higher, lapping hungrily at the timbers, turning the familiar structure into something both mesmerizing and terrifying. She stood back just far enough to feel the heat without being consumed by it, her body tense but controlled, every muscle coiled with awareness. The fire was no longer a tool but a companion, moving with a life of its own, obeying its own instincts, spreading and climbing with patient insistence. Smoke curled and twisted into the night, thick and dark, carrying the scent of burning wood and oil, a signal that the order of the plantation was fracturing. She watched as the glow reflected off the nearby buildings, the big house, the sheds, the barns, each surface now bathed in color it had never known. Shadows stretched and danced, creating new patterns that seemed almost alive. The plantation's familiar lines, the straight paths, the neat arrangement of structures, the measured distances, distorted in the firelight, appearing chaotic and vulnerable. The illusion of control was dissolving, and she felt a sense of inevitability in it, as if the fire itself had been waiting for this moment for years. Her own hands were steady, though her chest beat with a rhythm that matched the crackle and pop behind her. The sound was intoxicating, a steady, consuming voice that spoke without words, filling the air with power. She inhaled slowly, deeply, feeling it in her lungs, letting it fill her with a strange, calm energy. She did not panic, did not waver, did not consider turning back. This was a night she had imagined countless times, rehearsed silently in the dark corners of her mind. Each step had led to this, each memory had shaped her into someone capable of seeing it through. She thought of the people inside, unaware, wrapped in sleep or feasting or singing prayers that could not reach beyond walls. Their lives had been calculated and controlled, built on a system that depended on submission and silence. They had assumed she would continue to submit, continue to remain unseen. That assumption was no longer valid. The fire spoke louder than her voice ever could, louder than their prayers or their songs. It bore witness to everything, changing the balance that had always favored them. A gust of wind shifted suddenly, carrying smoke and ribbons that curled across her path. She bent slightly, inhaling cautiously, letting the movement of the air guide her, aware that each breath could carry more than just smoke. Her mind stayed sharp, cataloging exits, escape routes, and the behavior of the fire as it climbed higher, faster than she had anticipated. She felt no fear, only clarity, the clarity of someone whose loss had left them with nothing to lose, and everything to act for. The sound of timber splitting echoed in the yard, a violent punctuation that made her flinch just slightly, reminding her that destruction had weight and force. Yet she did not pause for long. The plantation had been built on centuries of violence, on the backs of countless lives bent and broke. Tonight the cycle of power shifted. She did not celebrate it, did not feel glee. She felt focus. She felt the gravity of action, the certainty of cause and effect that the fire embodied. Smoke thickened, rising in columns, black against the star-strewn sky. She followed a path along the edge of the yard, careful not to stumble, aware of every step. The heat at her back was steady now, a tangible presence that demanded respect. She welcomed it. It reminded her that what she had done was real, that she had taken control of something that had always controlled her. Even when she had survived every day in silence and fear, her mind drifted briefly to her child, the image clear and sharp, no longer accompanied by the edge of panic but by the hardening sense of purpose that had grown in her since dawn. This action, this fire, was not revenge in the childish sense, but an extension of every choice she had ever made to protect, to endure, to survive. The absence of her child had been a void, but it had not left her powerless. It had given her direction, the single point around which everything else now revolved. She paused again near a fence that bordered the far side of the property. From here, she could see the reach of the flames more fully, the way they climbed the corners of the main house, licking at roof lines, sending sparks into the wind. Her gaze swept the horizon, noting the glow that reflected against distant trees, illuminating the landscape in stark relief. The plantation had seemed eternal, immovable. Now it seemed fragile, alive with heat and sound, subject to forces it had never considered. Steps approached behind her, soft, hesitant. She froze, muscles tensing, ready to. But it was only a shadow passing, a figure moving in response to the fire's illumination. She remained silent, still, blending with darkness, aware that the element of surprise was hers alone to wield. The rules of this night were not the rules of. She dictated the terms, and everything else responded. Her thoughts returned to the structure she had first ignited. The fire had consumed it quickly, spreading along the oil-soaked wood, climbing higher than she expected, flames reaching toward the sky as if claiming it for themselves. The building, once ordinary and unremarkable, now radiated power, transforming from a symbol of control into a testament to what happens when someone refuses to be controlled any longer. She felt no pride, only acknowledgement. This was necessary, inevitable. The heat pressed against her from behind, growing warmer, closer. She inhaled through her nose, tasting smoke and wood, and the faint tang of iron. Her skin prickled, senses heightened, each nerve attuned to movement, sound. The plantation had been a world of rules, routines and assumptions. Tonight all those structures were bending, breaking, reshaping themselves according to forces they had never recognized. She moved along, confident, controlled, carrying herself as one who had mastered the terrain, the time, and the consequence. A distant scream or shout echoed faintly, caught and lost in the roar of flames. She did not turn. She had expected some reaction, but she had also calculated that the chaos would unfold in waves, that the fire's immediate attention would dominate all else. The plantation's systems of authority and surveillance were no match for unpredictability fueled by desperation and intimate knowledge of every blind spot. She felt satisfaction in the precision of her plan, though it was calm, not boastful. Smoke thickened further, curling and twisting like living things, masking and revealing in turn. The fire crackled and popped, creating its own rhythm, a steady hypnotic percussion. She walked through it as she would have walked through a familiar path during daylight, her feet sure, her hands steady, her mind alert. Every sensory input reinforced what she already knew. Control had shifted, and she was at its center. She paused briefly at another corner, taking in the breadth of the destruction. Flames now reached multiple points, consuming materials that had once symbolized order and domination. The air shimmered with heat, waves rising, distorting the. The plantation was no longer a place of quiet authority. It had become a stage for something elemental, raw, undeniable. The people within, The structures they had relied upon, and the authority they assumed to hold were all subject to this new force. She adjusted her movement, careful to stay with shadows, aware of both the fire and the open paths leading away. Her mind catalogued possibilities, measuring risk, anticipating reaction. She felt no fear, only clarity born of necessity and preparation. The plantation's confidence had been shattered, replaced with uncertainty, and she moved in that space, fully alive, fully aware, unyielding in the wake of her resolve. The heat grew more intense as she moved farther from the initial ignition point, flames reflected in windows and mirrors of water, flickering against surfaces that had never seen disturbance. She listened to the fire's voice, letting it guide her, marking paths of safety and influence. The plantation in all its supposed stability had been transformed in minutes, reshaped by knowledge, courage and the inevitability of consequence. And she walked forward, calm, deliberate, and entirely present, carrying with her the weight of action and the certainty that this night would never be forgotten.
Smoke filled the air thickly now, curling in restless ribbons that carried the scent of burning timber and oil into every corner of the plantation. The heat was a living thing, pressing outward, warping the night, creating waves that shimmered against her skin. She stayed low, moving along familiar paths, letting the fire claim the space behind her while she advanced carefully, deliberately. Every step had been measured, rehearsed in her mind 1,000 times, yet the immediacy of the moment sharpened her senses in ways nothing could have prepared her for. The glow from the flames reflected off windows and low clouds, painting the yard in flickering hues of orange and gold. The big house, once a symbol of order and permanence, was now a shifting, unpredictable shape, its structure beginning to buckle under heat and flame. She observed the patterns of fire with a detached attention, understanding how it consumed, how it spread, and how it could be guided, controlled, without her direct touch. The fire obeyed its own rules, but it answered to the slightest touch of knowledge, and she had that knowledge stored deep in her bones. Around her the world had changed in subtle ways. The usual nighttime sounds, creaking wood, distant laughter, the soft call of animals, were swallowed by the roar of flames. Smoke curled around the trees and fences, obscuring vision, turning familiar pathways into abstract forms. The plantation, designed to enforce hierarchy and obedience, now seemed fragile and chaotic, reduced to shapes and shadows as though the fire had stripped away centuries of certainty. She moved within it like a ghost, her presence known only to herself, and perhaps to the fire that seemed to recognize her command. Her thoughts were steady, focused, untroubled by the chaos erupting behind her. She did not need to imagine the fear of those inside. She knew it would come, inevitable and rising, as they realized that control was slipping through their fingers. That realization had been a long time coming, delayed only by their assumptions of superiority. She did not relish it in a petty sense. She observed it as consequence, as truth being revealed through action, a law made tangible by heat, flame, and smoke. She walked toward the edge of the property, eyes tracing the shapes of outbuildings, the distant quarters, the neat rows of crops that had once defined order. Everything had a place, everything a purpose. Until tonight the arrangement of objects and people had seemed eternal, unchangeable, natural. Now flames stretched across those lines, disrupting, altering, reshaping. She felt no triumph, only clarity. The world had rules and she had just rewritten one of them. Her hands brushed against rough bark as she passed trees lining the yard, the texture grounding her, reminding her of earth beneath her feet. Smoke thickened further, stinging eyes and filling lungs, but she did not falter. She adjusted her breathing, slow and deliberate, letting the fire's voice fill her ears, guiding her. It was a rhythm both ancient and immediate, a pulse that connected destruction to intention, chaos to purpose. She felt it in her chest as keenly as the heat at her back. The first distant cries had begun, faint but rising, piercing the layers of flame and smoke. The people inside the big house were awake now, disoriented by the sudden violence against the order they had always relied upon. She did not look back to confirm. She had prepared for this, calculated the timing, understood the limits of what she could control. Their panic was an extension of what she had set in motion, not its aim. She was not there to watch, not there to punish with personal vengeance. She was there to act, to restore balance where injustice had ruled for too long. She paused near the fence line, listening carefully. The fire's roar and the distant voices created a singe, layered soundscape. There was chaos, yes, but also structure, movement within movement. Smoke swirled around her, carrying the scent of heat and resin and burning dreams, tangible and suffocating. Her skin prickled, alert to every nuance, every shifting shadow, every sound of splintering wood. She adjusted her path accordingly, moving with quiet certainty, knowing that each step was part of a larger pattern, a silent choreography of action and consequence. The fire had spread to multiple structures now, the flames climbing rooflines, catching attics, consuming beams. Sparks rose into the sky, drifting and falling like miniature meteors carried by the wind to places she could not see, yet had predicted. She noted the way heat radiated outward, the way smoke clung to low areas, the way sound distorted in the roar. Each observation confirmed that her plan was succeeding, that preparation and patience had brought the moment to fruition. She thought of her child again, the thought no longer raw with grief, but as a lodestar guiding her movement. The absence that had fueled her mourning, that had haunted every step, now lent her clarity and purpose. Each action was deliberate, each movement informed by years of survival, by loss, by an intimate understanding of the plantation's rhythm. She was both spectator and participant in the transformation occurring behind her, invisible yet in full command of her own presence. The wind shifted slightly, sending a new wave of heat and smoke across her path. She ducked instinctively, letting the movement of the air dictate her steps, moving along edges and shadowed paths. Trees and fences became guides, their positions memorized, understood, part of the choreography she executed without hesitation. The plantation, built on predictability, was now unpredictable, unsteady, reshaped by fire and intent. She caught sight of a distant reflection, light flickering off a window far from the initial ignition point. It reminded her of how small details mattered, how attention and knowledge could amplify impact. She adjusted her course slightly, remaining cautious but deliberate, aware that even in chaos there was order to be recognized, steps to be taken, boundaries to navigate. The fire continued to expand, consuming, transforming, speaking its own language in crackle and roar, and she moved alongside it as a partner rather than a master, letting its force guide without controlling entirely. Her chest rose and fell in rhythm with the distant flames, each inhalation grounding her, each exhalation a reminder of the control she still wielded over herself. There was no thrill, no elation. She did not feel vengeance or celebration. She felt alignment, the culmination of years of suffering, learning, observation and survival, channeled into a single, unyielding act. The plantation's confidence, its assumed permanence, was being undone methodically, and she was both witness and catalyst. As the first light of dawn began to touch the horizon faintly, pale and weak against the orange and red glow of fire, she did not pause. She continued along her path, following the edges of destruction, noting how structures shifted, how smoke rose, how sound traveled. Each step was careful, deliberate, informed by an intimate understanding of the space and the forces now in play. She thought briefly of what would follow, of the inevitability that humans react to destruction with fear, confusion and anger. That too was predictable, part of the natural order she had come to know intimately. The fire had rewritten rules, revealed vulnerability, imposed consequence where there had been none. She was the agent, but not the arbitrator. The flames carried their own authority. She moved deeper into shadow, past trees, and along paths previously familiar, each movement measured, aware and necessary. Smoke continued to curl around her, carrying scent and signal, wrapping the world in its transformative haze. Behind her structures groaned, shifted, succumbed to the heat, the fire consuming not only wood, but symbols of control, of entitlement, of power unearned. Her thoughts returned to her own endurance, to the long nights spent learning, watching, survive. Every lesson, every memorized routine, every careful step of obedience had led to this, and now, in the dark surrounded by smoke and flame, she realized the culmination of knowledge, patience, and grief had created a force unstoppable, an inevitability that could no longer be denied. The plantation burned, and with it centuries of assumed safety and authority. She continued to move through the night, grounded, focused, alive, her mind clear, her body steady, carrying with her the weight of what had been taken, the certainty of what had been set in motion, and the undeniable knowledge that the world had changed forever, that the night would remember, and that she had finally, irrevocably made her mark as the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon. The plantation no longer stood as it had, its carefully constructed order reduced to smoldering beams and ash-strewn grounds. Smoke spiraled into the sky, a dark defiant banner that announced the shift in power, the reckoning long overdue. The fire had done what prayers, pleas, and patience could not. It made visible the injustice that had been ignored for generations. She stood at the edge of the burning estate, chest heaving, hands blackened, eyes fixed on the destruction she had orchestrated. The weight of grief that had once threatened to crush her had transformed into a force of purpose, a proof that even in the deepest despair, agency could be reclaimed. The child she had lost would never be returned, but in this act, she had reclaimed a part of herself, unyielding, unstoppable, and undeniable. Around her the smoke and flames carried a message that no words could capture. The plantation, a symbol of control and oppression,
had been reduced to ruin, a testament to the consequences of cruelty and the strength of a spirit pushed beyond endurance. The people who had slept so comfortably in their assumed security would awake to chaos, a world no longer dictated by their entitlement, and the memory of this night would haunt them forever. She turned away from the burning estate, feeling a strange calm settle over her. The fire had not been vengeance alone, it had been justice rendered with precision, inevitability and power. Every step she took away from the flames was lighter than the steps that had brought her here, burdened no longer by fear, by obedience, or by helpless. She walked into the uncertain dawn carrying the knowledge that one life, one act of courage, could reshape a world that had once seemed immovable. And as the smoke drifted higher, blotting out the first rays of sun, one truth remained clear: power built on cruelty is never absolute, and even in the darkest corners of despair, a single spark fueled by loss, grief, and unwavering resolve can ignite a change that burns forever.